Okay, I'm reading the Consumer Leasing Act. It's also known as Regulation M. It's issued by the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, but I'll get into that, I'm sure. In 1976, Congress enacted the Consumer Leasing Act to ensure that consumers would receive meaningful, accurate disclosures of the terms of leases for consumer goods. These disclosures allowed consumers to compare lease terms more effectively and thereby obtain leases on the best terms and conditions possible. The Act limited balloon payments in consumer leases and enabled consumers to compare lease terms with credit terms where appropriate. The Act was implemented by Regulation M, Consumer Leasing. It requires disclosures to consumers before consummation of the lease agreement. In 1996, the Federal Reserve Board revised Regulation M as a part of its periodic review and update of all of its regulations. The growth of consumer leasing of automobiles made this revision timely. In 1995, leases accounted for fully one-third of passenger car deliveries. The revised Regulation M requires that disclosures be given in a more meaningful format. It also requires that certain warnings regarding early termination fees be given to the consumer. The revised Regulation M was effective April 1st of 1997. In 2010, Congress enacted the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act. This law amended the Consumer Leasing Act by raising the threshold coverage of the law to $50,000. Regulation M was subsequently changed to accommodate this requirement effective July 21st, 2010. This amount will be subject to change annually and track the Consumer Price Index for urban wage earners and clerical workers. The CPI-W. In 2011, the authority for Regulation M was transferred to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Subsection I, Coverage. A. Regulation M covers leases that 1. Have a duration of more than 4 months, 2. Are for an amount not exceeding the threshold to be adjusted annually based on the CPI-W, 3. Are made by a natural person, and 4. Involve personal property used primarily for personal, family, or household purposes. B. Exemptions. 1. Leases for agricultural, business, or commercial purposes. 2. Leases made to an organization such as a corporation, partnership, or governmental unit. 3. Leases of personal property that are incidental to the lease of real property if such lease provides the leasee has no liability for the value of the property at the end of the lease term except for abnormal wear and tear, and the leasee has no option to purchase the leased property. Credit sales under Reg Z is also an exemption. And then you have requirements of Section 2, disclosures. Timing. Disclosures must be made before consummation of the lease. 2. Form of disclosures must be made clear and conspicuous and in a form the consumer can keep, must be dated, must identify the lessor and lessee, can be made together, or either the contract itself must be above the space for the leasee's signature, or a separate statement that identifies the transaction. E. Certain disclosures are required to be segregated. These may be made separately or may be segregated on the contract itself. F. If there are multiple terms of property, the property description may be in a separate statement. And G. Disclosures may be made in a language other than English. However, an English language disclosure must be provided on the leasee's request. Content of segregated disclosures. The following items must be disclosed in a form that is segregated from other information. That is the amount due at lease signing or delivery, itemized by type and amount, including your refundable security deposit, an advanced monthly or other periodic payment, capitalized cost reduction, and itemization of how the amount will be paid, and type and amount only required in a motor vehicle lease using the model form. Number, amount, and due date of payments scheduled, and the total amount of periodic payments. This is still content of segregated disclosures. So that would be the number and the amount of due dates of payments scheduled and the total amount of periodic payments. C, the total amount of other charges payable to the lessor that are not included in the periodic payments itemized by type and amount. D, the total payments with a description such as the amount you will have paid by the end of the lease. E, in an open-end lease, a description statement such as you will owe an additional amount if the actual value of the vehicle is less than the residual value. And F, in a motor vehicle lease, a mathematical progression showing how the periodic payment is derived containing the following information: gross capitalized costs, including agreed upon value of the vehicle, capitalized cost reduction, adjusted capitalized costs, residual value, depreciation of any amortized amounts, rent charge, the difference between the total and the base periodic payments over the lease term minus the depreciation of any amortized amounts, total of base periodic payments, lease payments, base periodic payment, itemization of other charges that are part of a periodic payment, and your total periodic payment. Now, I'm a little lost here because this is the Consumer Leasing Act. Does that mean that that's what it does mean? It's not renting real estate. It's only personal property. Primarily for personal, family, or household purposes. This is not what I expected. Let's go with an early termination notice that contains the following. 1. A warning to the consumer that a substantial change may result from early termination required only in a motor vehicle lease. And 2. An amount of any penalty or other charge for early termination. The penalty must be reasonable. In a motor vehicle lease, a notice of wear and tear standard warning consumers that they may be charged for excessive wear and tear and specifying the amount or method of determining any charge for excess mileage. Purchase price. These are also things that need to be made separate disclosures. Purchase price if the purchase option is at the end of the lease term. Furthermore, a statement referring the leasee to the lease document for other information, including early termination, purchase options, and maintenance responsibilities, warranties, latent default charges, insurance, and security interests. And lastly, rent and other charges required by the lessor and paid by the lessee, if applicable, with a description such as the total amount of rent and other charges imposed in connection with your lease. State the amount. The content of non-segregated disclosures. These disclosures may be made separately or as part of another document, such as the lease agreement. However, other information cannot be stated, used, or placed so as to mislead or confuse the consumer. Other disclosures include the description of leased property sufficient to identify it, a statement of the conditions under which a lease or leaseor may terminate the lease before the end of the lease term, along with the amount, or a description of the method of how the amount is determined, of any penalty or other charge for early termination, and a statement of maintenance responsibilities, including the party responsible, and a description of the responsibility, the lessor's reasonable requirements for wear and use, if any, or whether the lease has the option to purchase the leased property during the lease term, and if prior to the end of the lease term, the purchase price or method for determining it, and when the lessee must exercise it. F, the leasee's liability, if any, for the difference between the residual value of the leased property and its realized value. And G, the lessee's right to an independent appraisal of the property if the leasee's liability at early termination or at the end of the lease is based on the realized value of the leased property, and that the appraisal will be binding on all parties. Page 44. 2. If at the end of the lease term the lessee is liable for the differences between the residual value and the realized value, a statement that there is a rebutable presumption that the residual value is unreasonable if it exceeds the realized value by more than 3 times the base monthly payment or more than 3 times the average payment allocable to a monthly period if the lease payment is other than monthly, and a statement that the lessor cannot collect the excess amount unless the lessor brings a successful court action and pays lessee's reasonable attorney's fees, or unless the excess is owing to unreasonable or excessive wear or use. The lessor's and lessee's right after termination of the lease to make any mutually agreeable final adjustment regarding excess liability. The total amount of official and licensee fees, registration, title, or tax is required to be made in connection with the lease. Identification of insurance, including the types and amounts of insurance paid through the lessor, whether voluntary or required, and if the lease must obtain the insurance, the types and amounts of the cost to the lessee. All express warranties and guarantees from the manufacturer or lessor that apply, the amount or method of determining the amount of any reasonable penalty or charge for delinquency, default, or late payments, a description of any security interest held or retained by the lessor other than a refundable security deposit, and a clear identification of the property to which it relates. If a percentage interest has been advertised, a notice stating that this percentage may not measure the overall cost of financing this lease, the terms APR or annual lease rate or equivalents may not be used. And lastly, in a motor vehicle, open and lease, the fair market value at the inception of the lease and the aggregate cost of the lease at its expiration must be stated along with the differential between them. General disclosure requirements. A. So what I just read were the disclosures that don't have to be segregated. Now we're just talking about general. The leasing must receive a copy of the disclosure statement before consummation of the lease. If there is more than one lessee, one disclosure must be given to the lessor on behalf of all the lessors, and lessor may use reasonable estimates for amounts or other terms required to be disclosed but which are unknown or unavailable. Events after consummation that cause a disclosure to be inaccurate will not cause it to be a violation of law, and lessors may disregard the effects of the following. I. That payments must be collected in whole cents. 2. That payment dates may fall on a non-business day. 3. That months have different numbers of days. 4. That February 29th occurs in a leap year. And another general disclosure is that which may be provided to the lessee in electronic form, subject to compliance with e-sign, including the consumer consent requirements. Renegotiations, extensions, and assumptions. Any lease that is renegotiated, extended by longer than 6 months is considered to be a new lease, subject to new disclosure requirements, except when there is a reduction in the rent charge, one or more payments are deferred, whether or not there is a charge for the deferral, the lease is extended for not more than 6 months on a month-to-month basis, or otherwise, leased property is substituted with property of substantially equivalent or greater economic value. If no other lease terms are changed, in a multiple item lease, property is added, deleted, or substituted, provided the average periodic payment does not change by more than 25% and there is an agreement resulting from a court order. Advertising. No advertisement may state that a specific lease of property at specific amounts or terms is available unless the lessor usually or customarily leases or will lease such property at the advertised term or amount. Triggering terms. If an advertisement states that a specific lease or that amount of any payment or any capitalized cost reduction or other payment required before or at consummation or by delivery, or that no payment is required, such advertisements must also disclose the following information: that the transaction is a lease, the total amount due at or before consummation or delivery, the number, amount, due date, or period of scheduled payments, a statement of whether or not a security deposit is required, a statement that an extra charge may be imposed at the end of The lease term, where the leasee's liability, if any, is based on the difference between the residual value and the realized value of the property at the end of the term. However, a merchandise tag may refer to a sign or display prominently posted in the lessor's place of business that contains the required disclosures. Television or radio advertisements